Hi, so I'm Lauri and I'm the open source evangelist and an agile coach at Zalando. How many people here are not familiar with what Zalando is? Okay. Um, putting it simply, it's the largest European online fashion platform. So it's an e-commerce site and we sell a lot of clothing and shoes. So today I'm going to talk to you about how to avoid creating a GitHub junkyard. How many of you are actively managing a GitHub organization for your companies? Okay. Or managing your own GitHub repository by either deleting stuff that you don't use anymore or just putting more and more stuff in your personal GitHub repository. Okay, so this is the talk for you. One of my goals for you today, for us, is to help you achieve projects more like these household name projects. We got Docker, Kubernetes, etc. So to help you get a little closer to this and create the conditions for this kind of project development, and to avoid this, the sad land of abandoned dreams, the beautiful shiny cars that we were so excited about when we got them, and then we just watched them fall into disrepair, and it was tragic. The agenda for today is that first I will cover some basics about storytelling and the role of narrative and storytelling in making us less likely to build GitHub junkyards. Then I will talk about Zalando's GitHub junkyard, so offering you a case study. And then taking that case study and the learnings that we applied and collected along the way to show you how you can clean up your own GitHub junkyard, or better yet, avoid creating one in the first place. So I mentioned a little bit about Zalando. It's really big. Here are some statistics about its bigness. Lots of people, lots of money, lots of shoes being sold daily. About me, I also have a lot going on, so these are some of the activities. I mentioned what I do professionally there at Zalando. I'm also involved in Site Reliability Engineering Conference for the Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So if you're interested in speaking at SRECon next year, please talk to me. Also part of the Code Catalyst program for open source leaders. That's a fairly new initiative by Dell. And ambassador of Red Hat and OpenSource.com's Open Organization Ambassadors Program. So that is actually a volunteer group that meets around the world virtually to talk about open organizational values like transparency, collaboration, community. A lot of values that are inherent in open source development. And some projects that I do. If you want the quick TLDR storefront observation of what Zalando is releasing on GitHub, if you go to this URL, this is where we have a lot of our projects stored. We also have an incubator GitHub org for newer projects that are growing their audiences and were released within the last few months. So the reasons why we open source are pretty common to other companies. To develop software, obviously. To develop people, because when you put a project on GitHub, you have the opportunity to become a leader. How your project vision will change and shift. How you manage your contributors and other maintainers. How you keep the project alive and growing and developing. How you make decisions about which features from the community that you want to take on and integrate and which ones you want to reject. So there's all kinds of personal benefits to running an open source project. We also want to develop community. We rely heavily on open source software, Postgres, Golang. We're using so many open source technologies. So this is a way for us, and other companies do this as well, to offer open source projects back. Improving quality is also important. So we see that the work that we put online is often of a higher quality than some of the repos we might keep inside, because we have more eyes looking at them. It helps us build a reputation as a member of the community, and also it has the benefit of attracting talent. So in my past life, or one of my past lives, I was a journalist and online blogger. And so my job was to write stories and edit other people's stories and look for the elements of a story, the beginning, the middle, and the end, the characters, the details. So when I look at our open source offering, I want to know what's the story behind it. You know, why we're doing open source, but why are we doing it in this particular way? What are the stories behind what I'm actually seeing? And how did those stories come about? How are they evolving? And how will they end? And so I try to express this to my colleagues that are developing software. You know, we have about 200 teams, so lots of them want to publish things on GitHub. And I ask them, or encourage them to ask themselves, is the story that you want to tell with your project coherent? So will it make sense to your audience, which is potentially the world of GitHub, the internet? Is it interesting? So is this a project that's something that somebody might actually need? Does it solve their problem as well as yours? Is the process of making this thing enjoyable? Like, are we enjoying this? Is it relaxed, or is it super stressful because we already have like 70 repos that we've personally released and we feel the pressure to maintain them all? And is the work meaningful? So is it actually advancing problem solving for the industry or for ourselves, or is it likely to? And really importantly, does it answer why? Which is, you know, why does this exist? Why is it public? Why did we make it? Why do we think we can share it with you and you'll find value out of it? When we start to think in these terms, and we start to ask ourselves these questions of why, and we think of storytelling, well, that implies there's an audience. So it's somebody on the other side of that conversation. And for those conversations to have the highest impact, being empathetic is really important. So empathy is often regarded as an emotion, but it's actually not. It's a skill. And I argue that it's a software skill, because when it's not there, even a great project can fail because it doesn't actually communicate to users or contributors. It might not even communicate to the person who made the project if they go away for 6 months and come back and look at what they've done and they don't understand why they made the decisions that they made, why they did things a certain way. So empathy is often that make or break ingredient. One of my favorite thought leaders, Andrea Goulet, who is the CEO of Corgi Bytes, a consulting company in the US, and also writing a book about legacy code and communication, has a talk where she defines empathy as a skill that involves listening to your audience, understanding them, and then taking that information, that data, and forming our perspectives around that. So, you know, what is actually happening? What is this data being transmitted to our audience? And what will we do and how will we connect to them based on that data and communicate so that it reaches them? Chad Fowler is another great thought leader, and he's also written about empathy. And he says that it's actually really important for motivating teams to build software, because when you're connecting with your teams, connecting with your colleagues, connecting with your manager, or your manager connecting with your team, when you can empathize with the reality of your colleagues, then you understand each other, and then you can better inspire and engage and motivate each other. Now, empathizing is not some magical skill. It's actually something that anyone can develop. It's somewhat of a practice. If you just put it as a priority and you keep working at it, eventually you'll make progress. And it doesn't matter if you really enjoy being with people, lots of people, if you enjoy writing or not writing. If you're super shy, you can still be empathetic. Maybe you'll just choose a different communication channel than like giving a talk at a conference. You might use HipChat. You might write to your colleague an email, but you can do it. An important part of empathy is also empathizing with ourselves. We have to listen, understand, and apply a perspective to our own realities as well. So this often in the software context means that when we listen to the data that we are generating internally, we might make decisions about how much work to create, how much stuff to put on GitHub, how much work can we realistically maintain. And these kinds of questions that we ask ourselves can make open source development sustainable for us or not. When we don't ask these questions of ourselves, we often lose the plot of our stories. We might even lose ourselves because we're so busy taking care of our work and doing work that we don't have time to ask ourselves what we're actually doing or why we're doing it. We're too busy is a very common statement, especially in my home country, the US. I'm based in Berlin now, but I was living in New York City before that. And it's very electrifying and stimulating to live in New York because everybody's just building stuff and they're like the smartest people you've ever met in your life. And the city's tall because there's so many skyscrapers and it's just this hustle and bustle activity zone. And you hear I'm too busy all the time there. People work until crazy hours of the night. And there's different reasons for that. Practical reasons, it's expensive to live there. It's expensive to live in a lot of cities, so we have to earn our keep. And there's pressures maybe in the context that we're in to do those kinds of crazy hours and work that hard. But there's also the belief that we might get more status if we're busy than we're obviously necessary and we're maybe important. So our busyness is an example or illustrates our importance. We might be in a context where it's really competitive to see how much time can we spend at work. There are lots of companies that run like that. But what happens is, again, that plot gets missing. And then as Jeff Gotthelf writes in one of his books, or one of his recent blog articles, and Jeff Gotthelf is one of the founders of Lean UX and a really respected person in the product management and agile community, and an author. One of the points he's recently made in one of his articles is that this we're too busy mindset is really a symptom that we don't have a strategy or a set of priorities in place to be able to help us make the right decisions that will help us achieve a sustainable pace of work. So we don't actually have that direction or that path or that narrative that takes us from the beginning to the end in any way that makes sense so that we can actually answer that big question, why are we doing this and why are we doing it this way? We don't have time to answer those questions and really formulate any kind of coherent argument. And this happens, this ends up creating burnout for us. So like if we're too busy, we're trying to do too many things, we will burn out eventually because we're human and we're limited. And as Daniel Levitin, who is a scholar and a book writer, says, we lose IQ points when we're too busy. We get dumber. So we're not making the best decisions anymore. And when we're not making these great decisions, we don't have time to communicate with our audiences, our users, and our contributors. We don't even avail ourselves of things like writing documentation that can reduce our communication overhead. We don't usually write the docs in our open source projects. So GitHub did a survey earlier this year, released the results of their survey. It was about 5,500 respondents. 93% of those people said that they've seen documentation that has prevented them from being productive and effective. However, 60% of those respondents didn't take the documentation that they saw and improved it. Not because they couldn't, not because they're jerks. They probably just felt that they didn't have the time to do it. And as a result, our documentations often remain half-written, and we're not really communicating to our potential users and contributors as effectively as we could. We don't even ask other people to write our docs for us. And this has been really fascinating for me. So in February, I created a project, Feed Me READMEs, which is essentially free README writing help. Like somebody will send their link to me, and I'll edit the README when I have time. And so far, it has about 150 GitHub stars. So this is since February. I have a project that has like 4 times that many. I think I have 25 projects out of the millions in GitHub that have asked for editing, writing help. That's really fascinating to me because this is like a free service that everybody complains about. We want our docs to be better, but when it's right there in front of us, we don't take advantage of it. Sometimes when I do edit people's projects and I make the pull request, I never hear from them again. So that's interesting as well. If you want to try this out, I've added the URL, so hit me with your best README. In any case, when we don't have the plots, we don't tell the story of our software to other people. We leave the user like this cat, just kind of staring at this screen, like, what am I looking at? What is this? I don't know if this is going to solve my problem. I don't know if this has solved any of their problems. Like, I don't know what to do. And they will a lot of times we're in a hurry, right? We're too busy. So we're going to look at a repo, and if we don't see the evidence that it's going to solve our problem, we're going to move on. And when we're moving on, people are moving on from projects, they eventually become junkyard fodder, and they become abandonware over time. So this happened to us at Zalando. And now I'll talk to you about why it happened to us, how we created our GitHub junkyard, and then how we're getting out of it, or we actually have gotten out of it. It's a new to report, actually. It's taken a while. So just a little bit of history about how Zalando has worked. For the most part of it, for the bulk of its history, it was a very traditional command and control kind of tech organization. Your boss tells you what to do and you go and do it. Product manager tells you what to build and you go and do it. Our stack changed. It was Magento and PHP early on. In 2010, like many companies seem to have had this renaissance of Java in 2010. It's like a common story. But we did that. We went to JVM stack, and we started using more Postgres and integrating Python, and so building a more diverse tech stack. At this time, it wasn't really encouraged to develop any sort of open source work at all. So there were a handful of diehards that went ahead and created some Postgres and Python tooling. So some Postgres bells and whistles, and then created some infra tooling with Python and put those out on GitHub, wrote blog posts, and got a couple users here and there. But it wasn't really encouraged for them to do that. In 2015, we set about on a different path organizationally, one that emphasized autonomy, mastery, and purpose, which is captured in Daniel Pink's drive. And we said to teams that you're now autonomous and you can choose your own stacks and make your own decisions about how you want to work. We, at the same time, made a more strong commitment to Agile. We're shifting to a microservices architecture, emphasis on APIs, and also this idea of open source first. So that means that think of every piece of software that you build as potentially open sourceable. Maybe it won't be, but if you think that it might be, then you're going to have a higher chance that it will be. As part of this open source first mindset, we encourage people to share your code. So put it on GitHub. And in hindsight, this was a terrible decision, in my opinion, because it just created a junkyard. So whoops, that was not maybe we weren't specific enough about what kinds of code to share at the time. So we, not long after this management shift, we put things like this on the internet. So this is an AWS wrapper. It does a lot of different things. It's essentially built for autonomous teams to run their own AWS accounts and remain in compliance with auditing and security rules. As a publicly traded company, we have auditors we have to please. So, we put this on GitHub, and to use it, you have to install all of these orange blocks. And they have names that are based on Zalando private fashion labels. So the Docker registry is called Peer 1. The violation dashboard is called Your Turn. If you didn't know Zalando, and if you're in North America, you don't. I didn't know what it was. We don't do business in North America. We're big in Europe, but not there. And most of the tech industry is in North America, right, or in Asia. If you don't know the company and you come to the GitHub org and you look at this, this is we're really expecting you to trust us a lot to install and try to get all of this stuff working. And the fact is, people are pressed for time. They're not going to do that, and they didn't. So this actually worked for us, and it still does, this whole constellation of tools. And when we did a user survey of our own team a year later, 90% of the people said that it's flawed, but this works. When we get it to working, it's really quite powerful. And we should really be proud of the work that we did because it solves a pretty challenging problem very well and very reliably. But some of the feedback said, it's not human friendly. In fact, it's a zoo. All of these things, can we please have one CLI? Can we please make this simpler? Can we reduce the number of steps in deployment? Can we have different scripts to write and run so that we can actually get this up and running faster? And also the documentation, while it was comprehensive, so it was there and it was thorough, because of the complexity of the project and the pieces, many pieces moving, the documentation got outdated really quickly. So then it was obsolete and you couldn't follow it. We didn't do an external survey because there was really hardly anybody to survey. I think we had one component that got a couple users, but that was about it. So it was an open source project. It was public, but it wasn't really communicating to the community in a way that they could actually meaningfully communicate back to us. So like I said, we wrote the docs, but there were just too many docs. You know, one thing that you don't want to do is over-communicate and write so many docs that like you can't, you know, it's a big workload, plus you don't know where the answers to your questions are. But we wrote them, so that was good. Meanwhile, in the rest of the company, teams were starting to just release all the things. So there were maybe 5 or 10 repos going online per week. So by January 2016, when I started doing open source evangelism full time, we had about 400 repositories on GitHub across a couple organizations, and it just kept getting more and more. I started looking through all of these repositories to understand what was there, because nobody knew. I mean, there was just too much to look at. There was too much to decipher. And oftentimes what was missing were like huge components of a standard project, like any sort of answer of why we made it and what it was, whether we were using it and whether it solved a problem. You know, in terms of mastery, that one pillar from Daniel Pink's drive, like we weren't demonstrating mastery. Even if we were technically proficient, you know, we weren't often showing that because we weren't maybe returning to a project, you know, where maybe like there were 6-month gaps in when we would work on something. And so bugs might be going unfixed, issues weren't answered, pull requests might not be merged. So this wasn't really, even if we had it, we weren't showing that we were really technically proficient. The expectations were missing, you know, so what do we expect to happen with this project? What do we want from our audience? Do we want contributions or not? We weren't giving people signals. And essentials like licenses were often missing as well. And a license is really important to tell your audience how they can actually use your software. If they don't know, then they probably won't use it, because if they work for a company, they might be incurring risk for their company, and they're not going to make that decision. They're going to err on the side of caution and use something else. Because of these missing features in our repositories, we were also missing users and contributors for most of them. We had guidelines. So these were developed by the Open Source Guild, which was an informal body of open source enthusiasts. Our head of platform engineering at the time and I created the guild not long after the shift to the autonomy, mastery, and purpose model. So one of the first things that this guild did was create a set of advisory guidelines. The problem was, and these covered like licensing, namespaces, where to put your, you know, libraries, like how to manage your projects. They suggested that you write a README and have a license, and gave licensing and insight. But what happened was that many people on the team would pick and choose the guidelines that they wanted to enforce. So that share your code was absolutely the #1 guideline. Like, let's share all of it. But then the other things that, you know, were suggested by the peers in the guild kind of would maybe not become part of the release processes for these projects. Also, team cultures varied. So you might have a team that is super thorough and obsessed with perfect commit messages and changelogs, and then you might have a team that never writes any documentation at all. The why was often unclear in most of the stuff that we put out. And that we had an incubator, so we created an incubator to kind of try to drive some of these half-finished projects away from our main organization, so that, you know, if you would visit that dashboard I showed at the beginning with the statistics of our highlighted projects, you wouldn't see all of this half-finished deprecated stuff. But the incubator quickly became a cemetery for a lot of technical debt. We had a culture where we loved to publish, but we hated to delete things. Oftentimes, just getting it on GitHub meant it was done. The code as a documentation was, you know, a common mindset. I don't have to write a README, that's marketing crap. Like, go look at the comments, go into the code, figure it out. You know, if you can do that, then you're a real developer. That was common. The amount of projects meant more than the quality of them. The fear of missing out, that somebody would do it first and get there first. So we should just get this out the door and worry about the license and the README later. And this mindset of like, I use it, so it's useful. Well, it's useful for your team, but is it going to be, if it's dependent on our systems and coupled to them, how useful is it for somebody at a different company? Now, I covered the reasons why, we think that we're often so busy to kind of ask these questions when we're in the process of making software. I think the lack of confidence was a really strong thread in a lot of these decisions, because if you don't have key components of your software, you can never say, well, you did your best and it just failed. And there can be some cultural stigmas attached to failure. So we're a very international team. And so when in the United States, you could fail like a zillion times and nobody thinks twice about it. If you're not an American, you're in a different culture, failure can be like really crushing. So if you don't really give it your all, then you never really failed. You never got to the end of the story. And it's kind of a protection or safety. And it's totally valid, but it means that you might not do some things with your software to increase your success level, and it'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we don't plan these junkyards, and we certainly didn't plan ours. But it's that when we don't ask those questions about why, and we don't answer them, we often will end up, with a bunch of stuff that we're not sure why it exists on GitHub. So what if we had focused on some of those questions, and what if we had focused on the community and had a dialogue with them and worked on projects together? Now, the team that created that very complex collection of tools and services actually does develop in this way. They do go out to the community and prototype ideas, and they do document. So that team in 2 years has gone from creating complex stuff that no one can use to creating really valuable stuff that the Kubernetes and the Postgres communities are using a lot and really praising. So this can all be done, by the same people. You just change the context for working, and you will end up with completely different results. And it really helps because, like, even in the junkyard that we had, there was still treasure and value in all of it. That big system works. It still works for us. It's not like it was a fail. It maybe just wasn't, as an open source project, the easiest to use. But it was still a valuable thing. And many of the work that we were hiding in our hundreds of repositories, some of that code really was the treasure. So how do you dig that stuff out from all of the noise and show people what the really cool stuff is? That's the part I'll cover next. So how do you clean up a junkyard when you've got one? Or how do you avoid creating one? What I'll talk to you about will help you address either situation. So when I started in January of last year, looking repo by repo at what we had, it was kind of like being an archaeologist, uncovering the treasures and the artifacts of long ago. So I'd go by one and assess the repository for like what's missing, what's there. Is there any users outside of the company? Or we have contributors, how many contributors? And just making notes, and through this process I started to see some patterns, which I mentioned earlier, just like the lack of essential files, contributor guidelines, readmes, licenses, starting to understand what our narrative was through this work, and start to change the context for the team and how they were doing open source, to really think about sustainability. To think about, if we had developers that had dozens of repositories where they're the single maintainer, that person, and I'd see like notes from GitHub at midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, they were the only person in the company that really knew how that thing worked. And from a management perspective, you're creating that person's becoming a bottleneck and a constant firefighter. Like, let's do something differently here. Let's get some pressure off of them, let's help them develop a more sustainable workflow for themselves. This is all about changing a culture of development, and that takes a very long time. And I could have just said, like, you must do these things now. You must have a license or else. You must have a README or else. But A, that wouldn't be very compelling. It would create resentment right away. And also, it doesn't help my colleagues developing the software understand why. It just becomes a basic rule. And they're not engaged in that process of the negotiating and deciding, what might be an alternative path for their project. How would they manage it differently? What would they do with it? It would just be an order, and that was just not going to be successful. Like maybe in the short term, but in the long term, you're not going to build trust that way. So the process of going repo to repo has actually taken until very recently. We're still moving things around and archiving repositories because we had just so much of it. But this is a lot better and more fun and fulfilling and a lot less risky than just saying like, you must do it or else. When you're going to undertake an excavation process like this, there's some tools you can adopt that will help you along the way. So if you have guidelines, as we did, make them enforceable in some way. Like, use them. Don't just have them as a Google Doc in Google Drive. Like, actually give them teeth. And you can do that by creating a peer review group that enforces, or I don't want to use the word force because that's not really the right message, but that encourages people and guides them to follow the guidelines. A peer body of developers and leads that can actually like work with project maintainers and teams to adjust. You can also, just publish them and remind people of them regularly. You can also, when you're onboarding newcomers, you can share those guidelines with them immediately and say, this is how we develop open source. And then they're already on notice from day one. So you can use your guidelines in different ways, but you have to use them. You also can't create exceptions for the really smart, awesome developer, rockstar person. Like, they have to make good stuff too. Just because they're smart doesn't mean they can put all whatever they want on the company's GitHub org. You have to be treating people equally. You can use GitHub orgs to organize your repositories in different categories, like we did with the incubator. So the incubator was taking away some of the half-done and deprecated stuff away from our main, like, flagship GitHub org. You can create more orgs for specific projects with lots of components and use the power of GitHub to organize yourself effectively. You need patience. You also have to have a peer review culture where projects get looked at and there's a feedback process and people have to feel comfortable giving and receiving feedback. And that requires, establishing that comfort and trust level requires work. And then you have to create checks to make sure that projects continue to follow the guidelines and reflect them. With the no exceptions strategy, I mean, this is where an actual strategy, a document, really will help you because it's a single source of truth for how your development culture and the steps for that. It can remove the politics around, pet projects. It's best if it comes from a community review group, so different developers are also working on software, and it could rotate membership so that people, so that it's not like a perma committee. And the committee, the review group should definitely not be the committee of no. The idea behind it should be to help people publish things on GitHub, but only publish things that are worth publishing. You need to have support from leadership and middle management for this. A grassroots movement will not go very far if the leadership doesn't care about an open source strategy or open source standards. If leadership comes and they're the primary drivers of this, it will fail because then it will be an order and not something that people feel like they're engaged in or part of. And if middle management isn't there, and if you're a big organization, then you're just going to have a huge gap in the middle of people that, leads and heads that aren't really mindful of your strategy, and they won't be able to follow it or enforce it as a result. In addition to an actual strategy document for people to look at, you might just simplify that into rules of play. So we had a very long list. We recently cut it down to about 10 rules of play. So this is kind of like a checklist for people to follow if they want to put something on GitHub. And it's all about project sustainability and telling a compelling story that's coherent to the internet. You need a maintainer's file. So if I have a problem with the software, who can I call? You need a README, and it has to have meaning. It has to have instructions for downloading, installing, running, configuring software. It has to have that why does this exist component. Has this, and what is this project like, and what is it not like compared to similar projects. It needs to have a license file. So we follow the MIT license, and every project needs to have that plus some additional conditions around when we use third-party software. We need, we acknowledge that in certain ways in the license file. A security file, in case there are security risks or problems, again with contact info. No specific credentials or private identifiers can go into the software, so you have to check for that. You have to make sure that you're not risking private data, which is really important in Germany because the privacy laws are very stringent, and also any sort of business advantage that we have. You have to take your project to the security team so they can review it. And you also have to have code coverage evidence, so some kind of badges or just proof that you actually have tests. The way that we distribute this set of rules of play to the team when they want, or teams when they want to publish something, is we just send them a Google form checklist, and it's pretty simple. There's 17 questions now, but most of them are yes or no. So they're not like long essays. It's just like, yes, we did this, yes, we did that. And if you do all those things, it should take 5 minutes to finish. You submit it to the open source review group, which is a team of engineers, me, some members of the compliance team, legal, security. We look at your project, we discuss it with you, and then we release it if everything checks out. As part of this process with the review group, we encourage and identify a purpose for the project. So we have teams do a product analysis, and we give them a template for it, so they can just say, what is the vision? What do I want to have this doing in 6 months? Who is the audience? What is this like? What is this not like? And really think about those questions so that they have the answers and they put their work into a context. That means take peer feedback as user research. So when the teams are doing these product analyses, hopefully they're talking to people around them. And that's instant user research for them to incorporate into the project development. This is really important, this kind of exercise in analyzing an idea in a project for what its rationale for existing is and who will use it, because it gets us outside of our own heads. We have to test our hypotheses with our peers and other people. And it's also really valuable because if the response is good, then we know that the project might actually get some users and it won't go into the junkyard. It might have some additional contributors as a result of those conversations that feel really excited about the project and want to help. There's different ways you can do this. Playing a game, taking a survey. That's not super personal because it's just a form. My favorite way is the one-on-one interview where you can actually interact with somebody, see their facial gestures, see if they look excited or not, if they look bored. And this requires empathy, but we said earlier that that's a skill that you can develop by just paying attention to the person's gestures and listening to their words and taking notes and collecting that data. When we do these kinds of exercises and user research, then we can actually start envisioning a user. And here's the cat again, but this time they're staring at their computer screen and they're like, oh yeah, I get it. This project speaks to me. I am Jen Meow Meow. I'm a back-end developer, and I have to work in a hurry, and I want something that will fix my problem, like a great monitoring solution with awesome dashboards. And so I like this because this is satisfying my needs. You can create and envision and imagine this person before you start coding with the data that you collect from your user research. Then you can write docs, right? Because you have a project in place. Writing the docs, covering these bases of why it exists, how it works, sends the message. And this is a template. I'm running out of time, so you can go here and get a template for how you can write your README in an effective way. We use organizations as steps. So I said earlier you can use GitHub org to manage your output. We have a flagship, Zalando, for our best projects. The incubator, which is now an actual incubator instead of the graveyard. And GitHub Enterprise is where most of our work goes. It just stays behind the firewall and inside our internal organization. So it's good to use these tools and platforms to organize. Teaching all of this stuff takes time. It's really fast to spin up a new org or write some guidelines, write some rules. But really that mindset shift and getting people to actually believe in them instead of just doing them because they feel like they have to takes time. But it's really valuable and rewarding to do this because it opens up so many more opportunities for project creators to really test themselves and test the validity of their projects. If you want a really nice and flashy set of guides for this, the To-Do group, which is a consortium of Facebook, Google, and other awesome organizations that we all know, has just released these set of guides that help you create an open source program, how to measure it, how to do licensing. So there's a lot of really valuable information there in addition to the links I've shared earlier. My closing thought is this. I've talked a lot about creating new stuff. Maybe we don't need to create all this new stuff. Maybe we just have to pay attention to and help the stuff that's already there. And this is Andrea Goulet again, who says, you know, I'd like to have a Mender fair instead of maker fairs and hackathons. Like, why don't we just fix the bugs and the docs and the work that's already out there? There's millions of projects on GitHub that need your attention and help. So maybe instead of spinning up something new, go and help someone else. And you might come up with a new friend, a new opportunity. And it might be a lot less hard and less time consuming for you because you can share the work instead of just take it on your own. And then you won't have a junkyard because it'll be someone else's junkyard if anything goes wrong, but it won't be yours. And hey, there's some advantages to that. Thanks.
We'll have some questions for live questions. Okay.
Hello. Did you ever try to gamify any of those aspects of adoption of rules and guidelines? Let's call them guidelines over rules.
It's still a little early, so no. But it's a great idea. So right now, I have my primary job is another job, and it's the same for the review group. So we've been kind of working through the issues in our processes to really refine them. But yeah, that's a great idea for eventually, like in the next few months for us. Thanks. I'm actually creating a licensing game for Open Source Summit next week, a licensing and compliance game. So that is a little gamification, but it will be at the summit.
I guess that's it. Thank you, Lauri.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Yeah. So.